Welcome to the City Club of Eugene's November 4th, 2022 program, Literacy in Oregon, Challenges and Solutions. This is the 9th program in our 2022-2023 programming year, and my name is Karin Knutson. I am City Club's president. Welcome to everyone here with us and listening today. It is an absolute pleasure to have you as a part of this important community conversation. For more than 30 years, City Club of Eugene has been delivering our mission to build community vision through open inquiry by recording weekly programs on topical, engaging community issues. City Club creates the space for civil discussions about civic issues, and today we turn our attention to Oregon's literacy crisis. Support for the City Club of Eugene is provided by our members and both business and in-kind sponsors. Our diamond sponsors are Kaiser Permanente, the University of Oregon, Peace Health, and Lane Community College. And we appreciate the support we receive from the City of Eugene and Lane County. You too can support City Club's mission and our weekly programming by becoming a member at our website, cityclubofueugene.org. We invite you to join us for City Club programs and to hear directly from local, national, and international experts on current events. And we also encourage you to ask questions of our speakers every week. Today is no different. We'll have a Q&A session after hearing from our speakers today. So I'll now hand off to City Club's president-elect, Andrew Kolek, and thank him for coordinating today's program. He'll introduce our speakers and say a little bit more about what we're going to discuss today.
Thank you, Karin. Even before the coronavirus pandemic, Oregon students were struggling to read. And the pandemic has deepened this challenge. Amidst this challenge, however, there are bright spots and opportunities to double down on solutions that are working in communities big and small right here in Oregon. So without any further ado, I want to welcome our panel of experts who will outline the challenge, some of the potential solutions to ensure that every Oregonian, no matter their age, can learn to read. And we're so excited to have our speakers here with us. First up will be Professor Audrey Lucero of the University of Oregon Language and Literacy Education Department. We will hear from Angela Uerbelau, who's the president and founder of Oregon Kids Read. And we will hear from Representative Barbara Smith Warner, who represents portions of Northeast Portland, Maywood Park, and Park Rose in the Oregon House of Representatives. First, Professor.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation. I'm thrilled to be here to talk more about literacy education. I am a professor at the University of Oregon in the College of Education. I've been working in language and literacy education for about 25 years, and this is my 12th year at the University of Oregon. So when I received the invitation for this session, the first thing that occurred to me was thinking about how we're defining literacy, because one of the things that I really advocate for is a broad, expansive view of literacy. When we think about reading and writing, there are, of course, the 5 foundational pillars of reading and writing. That's phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary fluency, and comprehension. But I think in recent years, many scholars and teachers have added a 6th dimension to that, which is engagement. And from my perspective, critical engagement with text is what literacy is really all about. I work with teachers all the time. I was actually in a book study group last night with teachers who said, I feel like we spend time teaching kids how to read, but I don't feel like we spend enough time teaching kids why we read. Like, why is reading important? What is the whole point of having a literate identity, being part of a literate community? And so teachers will use words like excitement and love and engagement, and those are the kinds of things that we really want to foster in children. That's clearly lacking in our society in general. We know that most adults don't read for pleasure. That I think is concerning and kind of speaks to the fact that we're not really creating engaging literacy opportunities for kids. Now, one of the ways to do that, a very important way to do that, is to support kids in becoming phonemically aware decoders. But I think what often happens in this conversation is that we equate reading with decoding. And actually, decoding is a very small part of reading. right? So I know that those who are listening on the radio won't be able to see this, but I was just preparing for my winter course on literacy, and I have this book, right, The Literacy Continuum, which is about 1,000 pages. So these are all the components of teaching kids to read and write between, pre-K to 8th grade, and it includes all of the pieces you might expect. But it's really a very complex puzzle of various pieces that need to come together. And so I noticed on the City Club website for today's event, the statement that something like only 43% of students are being taught to read in Oregon. And I would strongly push back on that statistic. I don't think that any child in Oregon is not being taught to read. I think there are different ways of approaching literacy instruction. And I also have never been in a primary classroom that didn't expressly teach phonemic awareness and phonics. So I wanted to just position myself as starting the conversation about literacy in a broad way of thinking about literacy and how we might start to address the very real concerns that people have about children's reading and writing in Oregon. And with that, I will pass it on to Angela.
Thank you, Professor Lucero. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I am Angela Uwerbalo. I'm the founder of Oregon Kids Read. We are a grassroots network of volunteers who are dedicated to literacy in Oregon. And I'm just in my short talk, I just want to signpost for everyone kind of what I'll be covering so you know where we're headed. First, I'm going to talk about where we are, which has been mentioned previously. Oregon is in a state of emergency when it comes to literacy, so I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll also talk about what's needed to address the crisis, because there are solutions to this. Our children are capable of learning how to read, so discussing that. And then lastly, what we can do together as individuals and as groups to make sure that we are getting the children in Oregon what they need in order to learn how to read. But I'd first like to start, because so much of literacy is about stories, I really appreciate your openness to me sharing a personal story about literacy. So literacy is about liberation. Literacy is about freedom. It's about autonomy. And I wouldn't be here today without that. And I don't mean I wouldn't be sitting here today because I can read and I'm a fluent reader. I actually would not exist without literacy and without reading, because my parents had the ability to do that. So my father was from a small group of islands in the Pacific, in Micronesia. English was not his first language, and yet he became a fluent reader in English. My mother was from a small town in Majory, Ohio. They met because my mom was a nurse in the Peace Corps, and my dad was helping to create the Constitution for Micronesia. So when I say that I wouldn't be here without their ability to read, my parents were married at a time when intercultural relationships were very rare. Interracial relationships were still rare, and in some parts of the United States, actually illegal, at a time where women could not get a checking account without their husband's permission. So liberation, when we're talking about literacy, my parents came up at a time where their ability to access education changed the world and opened it for them. And that's what we want for all children across the United States. And yet where we are today, we are falling far short of that. So Andrea, if you don't mind sharing the first slide, which encapsulates it gives a snapshot of where we are right now in Oregon. So this slide, for those of you who are joining us by radio, the headline on the top line of the slide says less than half of Oregon third graders are being taught to read. And I heard Professor Lucero, I heard you at the beginning, and I understand when you said that teachers in the classroom, many are doing their best to teach children how to read. And I want to clarify this, when we talk about half of our kids in third grade not being taught to read, this is not about individual teacher failings. This is about a systemic failure of the state of Oregon. And this is a national problem as well, where our teachers in general education classrooms are not being prepared in their teacher prep programs to have the tools they need to be able to get kids across the line when it comes to reading. So when we're looking at the statistics, and these are the latest here in Oregon, we see like who is not actually being taught to read, who is not being given the tools they need to access the liberation and freedom and autonomy of literacy. So 39% of our third graders are being able to access reading. And just flipping that another way, that means that 61% of our third graders are not being able to read at benchmark. And when we look at the rest of these groups of students, we're looking at economically disadvantaged students, American Indian and Alaska Native students, who are at 79% of them are not being able to access reading in the way that they deserve. Almost 80% of our Latinx students, almost 80% of our Black students, 80% of our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students. And we're looking at 92% of our English learners who are not being able to access reading in the way that they deserve. And I also want to make it clear that the research shows almost any child of any background has the capability of learning how to read when they are given the right instruction. So that's the challenge. And Andrea, if you don't mind switching to the next slide, I want to go on to the solution. So as Professor Lucero mentioned at the beginning, the research shows, and when we're talking about the science of reading, we're not talking about a curriculum. We're not talking about a set of specific materials. We're talking about a body of research over 40 years of what is needed in order for our children and adults to be able to access reading. And these are the 5 pillars that Professor Lucero mentioned, which I appreciate. One is phonemic awareness, the ability to identify and segment sounds. So reading actually starts, the ability to learn to read starts before we ever get to the printed word. It also includes phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. We need our children to start with the foundational building blocks before they can go on to comprehension. They need to know how to decode. They need to know how to unlock the language before they can get to comprehension. So in some ways, I wish that this slide, which is 5 pillars holding up a roof, was actually a staircase, because we need to start with phonemic awareness, the ability to hear and segment sounds, and then move next to phonics, onto fluency, onto vocabulary, and onto comprehension. Andrea, if you don't mind taking the slide down now, that would be great. So what can we do together to interrupt and reverse this emergency that we're experiencing in literacy? I think the number one thing that we can do immediately is to offer kids in our most struggling schools here in Oregon the same things that wealthy families across the state and across the country do for their kids when their kids are struggling. And that is, they get expert tutoring to be able to support them where they are and move them along. So that's one of the things that Oregon Kids Read is really advocating for, is that intensive tutoring. And systemically, we also need to get our teachers the tools that they need to be able to teach in the classroom. And Oregon Kids Read, we started from a partnership with teachers. That's our origin story, of teachers coming to us to say, we keep doing things in the classroom and we're trying our best, but we're not able to reach our students and we don't know what to do. So teachers across Oregon need and deserve access to learning how to reach their students and have the tools that they need and deserve to be able to do that. So I really look forward to the conversation that we're going to have together around questions, but I want to pass it on now to a friend and great champion of literacy in the state, and that is Representative Barbara Smith Warner, and she can speak more to the details of what we can do legislatively in terms of policy in the state to move forward. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Professor Lucero, and thank you, Eugene City Club, for providing a forum for us to have this conversation today. I'm Barbara Smith Warner. I'm a state representative from Northeast Portland. I've been in the legislature for 9 years. I'm actually not running for re-election, so this will be my last year. And there's always a why when you become elected. What is the why that got you there? And the why for me was public education. I've got 2 kids who came through public schools, and when they started, I like to think of it as that's when my belief in public education went from the abstract to the concrete. I always kind of generally believed in that, but then once my kids were experiencing it, I was like, wow, This is important. There are huge gaps. There are huge varieties. And so what can we do? So what I want to talk about, I'm going to briefly, I'll tell you what I'm going to talk about in this opening segment. I'm going to talk about kind of how school funding, how education funding works in the state, how it has changed over time, some advancements we've had recently, and then some ideas for what we can do through that funding that will help to promote literacy in the state. So first of all, education funding in the state of Oregon. A lot of folks don't realize, but since the passage of Measure 5 and its limit on property taxes in 1990, about 2/3 of state funding now comes from the state. It used to be very local, 2/3 or more came from local communities. It was very dependent on property taxes, but after Measure 5 was passed in 1990, that transitioned over to primarily a state responsibility. However, Oregon is still, second item, a local control state. Which in this case means that there are 197 school districts in the state of Oregon. Each of them has its own elected school board, and each of those districts basically has decision-making authority over budgeting, curriculum, all of that in their districts. So there you might get a sense of the first kind of foundational struggle in education in the state of Oregon, which is the provider of the funding, that is the state, yet the most direct government entity, which is the local school board. So after Measure 5 passed in 1990, we have established in this state what is indeed recognized as an extremely equitable distribution formula. So that money, that 2/3 of the education money or more that comes from the state is distributed through something called the state school funding formula. And this is something that has kind of emerged in fits and starts, honestly, since 1990, when all of a sudden the state had this responsibility and was like, okay, how are we going to do this? So there have been some changes over the years, but basically it is really recognized as a very equitable distribution system. So what it does is it basically you have the pot of money that the state, that's a whole nother conversation that you can ask me about specifically, but just as a general rule, we have the pot of money that is for every 2-year budget cycle for our K-12 schools. And that is divided by the number of students that are being served in our schools. But each district does not just get a straight amount based on how many students they have. That formula is weighted to acknowledge the variety of challenges and advantages that different school districts have. So there's a weight for poverty, for how many kids you have in poverty, for English language learners, for pregnant and parenting teens, for districts that have very wide geographical areas and a lot of transportation costs. So the formula itself is extremely extremely equitable distribution formula, and that is how the money is distributed. However, now for my item number 4, we come back to the fact that it then goes out to those 197 school districts who are under no obligation to spend it based on that weighting. So do they generally? Sure. And when you talk to any school district, they will say, of course, they focus more on their ELL kids or on their high poverty areas. But there is no direct line or requirement that very equitably distributed funding is spent to address those particular needs that they got that weighting for. So this has become more of an issue over time with a variety of advocacy groups, folks who are very focused on how do we do better for our kids in education particularly. So the first really big change to this system was in 2016 when Measure 98, Ballot Measure 98 was passed. Ballot Measure 98 basically said that an X number of dollars per high school student was to be allocated to each school district, and that school district had to spend it on career technical education, dropout prevention, or college level education opportunities. So this really was the first time that there were stricter requirements put on money that was going out to school districts. And the districts generally were a fan of this, mostly because it was a new and dedicated source of funding, which was a great thing. But this was something that had been talked about more and more over the years of how do we put more direction on this funding without being too one size fits all and top down. Because the truth is, as somebody who's traveled around the state repeatedly, indeed, the Hermiston School District is very different than the Arlington School District, which is very different than the Medford School District, which is very different than Cottage Grove, right? You don't want to be too one size fits all. However, what Measure 98 came up with was what I think was a pretty decent kind of like tight, loose combination. Here's the 4 areas you have to spend it in, but you figure out based on your schools, your needs, your students, how specifically that works. So that Measure 98 model was then followed in 2018 and 2019 when the legislature established the Student Success Act. So I was the House Chair of the Student Success Committee. We traveled around the state in 2018, talked to and really listened to students, community members, teachers, administrators, admins, paraprofessionals, everybody involved in the school system. And then came back and in 2019 established the first dedicated source of funding for early learning to K-12 since Measure 5 had passed in 1990. And we use that model, that Measure 98 model. So we are like, okay, clearly everybody has different needs. And yet we heard the same things over and over. And so what we did was we said, yes, here's a dedicated source of funding. We're going to use a similar equitable distribution model as the state school fund. We're going to double weight poverty because we believe that does not get enough emphasis in our education, just the reality of that impact on our kids. And we're going to say, you have to use that money in one of 4 areas. You have to use it for mental and behavioral health, increased instructional time, decreased class sizes, or providing a more well-rounded education. And one of those things has to be mental and behavioral health, because that was really what we heard loud and clear from everywhere we went, was that need. So the Student Success Act provided that it was another step towards being more directive in the education funding that we provide as a state. Go after that. So in both 2021 and 2022, after, as we were continuing to manage the pandemic, having gotten a lot of good input from Oregon Kids Read, I submitted specifically in 2022 specific budget asks for 2 items to support the science of reading in order to help this literacy crisis. We put in a request for $20 million for science of reading training for teachers, focusing on those students and their teachers in the most struggling schools. It's called TSI and CSI. And I should have written down what those stand for, but I can tell you the language in this, as anybody who pays attention to education knows, it changes all the time. But it was the most struggling, kind of our most struggling school district. So we said, we have this federal money coming in. We have money from the Student Success Act that had been held for future engagement in more struggling districts. Let's take some of that and start now very aggressively on providing science reading teacher training. And let's do $10 million for high dosage tutoring. Neither of these things, unfortunately, happened in the 2022 session. And even though I'm not going to be in the legislature, I know I continue to advocate for this and have talked to a number of my colleagues. And it's interesting that Angela said in the beginning, use the term state of emergency, because what I would propose is needed in the same way that there's a lot of conversations about how we need as a state to declare a state of emergency about our houseless situation. I believe we also need to declare a state of emergency about our literacy situation and figure out everything we can do. I'm a believer in yes and, right? We don't need to just do one thing. We can do longer term teacher training. We can do shorter term teacher training. We can do high dosage tutoring in any and whatever, maybe it's going to work in person here and online here. But what we need to do is to look at every opportunity we have to really focus and really direct schools and the districts that they're in to really focus on this. There's a lot of options there. As I mentioned, there's funding through the statewide investment account from the Student Success Act. There's something called the Educator Advancement Council, which gets direct funding about teacher training. That's another opportunity to push this through. I just believe that we can and should look for every opportunity. Let's not worry about turf battles. Let's worry about really focusing our kids and their literacy needs as we go forward. And I just want to end by saying, Professor Lucero, I could not agree with you more about how important it is for engagement, right? Because you can teach somebody to read and they need that to be a successful human being. And yet the additional value they will get from being an engaged reader, a lover of reading. Books have been a key part of my life as long as I remember. I constantly have 5 or 6 books that I'm reading at one time. I'm never not reading. And the idea that not being part of my life, I can't imagine. So I'm thrilled. I completely agree that the more we can do to provide engaged, enthusiastic readers, and that can't happen until they are readers first, until they have those skills and ability. So with that, I think we're going to go back to Andrew for a pause before we go to questions.
That's exactly right, Ed. Thank the 3 of you so much. We will take a short break and we'll be right back with your questions. Now we have time for questions and answers with our expert panel about literacy, and Ann Bard, you can ask the first question.
Thank you, Andrew. My question is based upon colleges and universities in the state of Oregon. My question is, how many actually have a nationally certified program for teachers of reading? My understanding is there's only one, but I am interested in what Professor Lucero might know about this.
Well, so I guess my clarifying question would be nationally certified by whom?
There is the agency in Washington that certifies the programs for teachers of reading.
Are you referring
Portland State University has one.
Are you referring to the NCTQ?
Yes.
Okay. So actually, well, I can speak to this just for the University of Oregon, because obviously that's where I've been for 12 years. We are obviously certified by the state of Oregon through TSPC. So we offer elementary, secondary teaching licenses, as well as a reading endorsement and an embedded ESL endorsement. So we have the certification that we need to prepare teachers in the state. There are a number of agencies, independent agencies, who do sort of certification for different programs. NCTQ is one, and I noticed that it's one that comes up quite a lot in these conversations, but it's somewhat controversial in terms of the ways that they certify or the ways that they grade programs. So for example, if you look at the NCTQ website, you'll see that their means of analysis is looking at course syllabi and the textbooks that programs use. So as you can imagine, that's a fairly limited data set in terms of actually looking at what happens in those courses. The other thing is that they often don't include all of the courses taught in a program. So I was just looking at the NCTQ ratings this morning for my courses, one of which is their EDST 640, but we actually have 4 courses in our literacy sequence, 2 at the undergraduate level and 2 at the master's level, which are not included in that analysis. So we are not an NCTQ certified program, but I don't personally, having taught these literacy courses, I take that with a grain of salt in terms of what we are able to do and how we prepare teachers. I noticed that Joy asked a question in the chat about why colleges of education don't teach best practices. And I am a little bit confounded by this question, because we certainly do teach the 5 foundational principles, as I've said: phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, comprehension. I will literally have students say to me, well, Dr. Lucero, can you, like, yes, we know what you're going to say, the big 5. So it's not that those are not taught, but I think, I'll just kind of go back to what I said earlier about the sort of the disconnect between the science of reading and sort of more balanced approaches to literacy is where we start to get more tension. And this is not a new tension. The reading wars have been going on for 100 years. I actually do have some students read chapters from the history of reading instruction in my undergraduate course. So the science of reading is essentially the same as Reading First, No Child Left Behind, 2000, when President George W. Bush was in office. A lot of what we see now, this push for the science of reading, is the same push that was for very prescriptive rote phonics and phonemic awareness instruction in the early 2000s. It has been done for a long time. So I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why it's not happening, if it's not happening in classrooms. Because we do teach it in our teacher preparation program. And it has also been, like I said, part of actual national mandates in the past 20 years. I do just want to comment on one thing very quickly that Angela said when you showed the 5 pillars and said that it might be better envisioned as a staircase. I think the reason that we don't want to envision it as a staircase is because comprehension should always be the goal. I think of it as an umbrella more than a staircase, right? Phonics for phonics' sake is pointless. There is no good reason to learn to identify letters and letter sounds unless you are trying to make meaning, construct meaning through your reading or create meaning through your writing. So I'm very concerned about that, especially with ELL children and children from minoritized backgrounds, because those are the kids who tend to get lots of rote foundational instruction without attending to comprehension. And that's been shown over and over in the ELL literature, that if kids don't start engaging meaningfully with text, start making meaning, start having conversation about text from the very first day they set foot in classrooms, then they are going to become disengaged readers.
Thank you, Professor Lucero. I'd love to be able to respond. And I think, you and I and others, we are on the same page in terms of comprehension, of course, is foundational and super important. But if a child cannot decode a word, they will never get to comprehension. And currently in our schools, many of our children are being taught by a form of instruction that is not rooted in those building blocks. It's based on guessing. It's based on, here's a picture book. What do you see? If you don't know the word, that's okay. You can guess what that word is by the context of the pictures. And of course, to your point, when we want children to be able to comprehend and engage text, once those pictures go away and that child has never been given the tools to unlock the actual words in the text, they are floundering, they are lost. And I think when you use the term reading wars, we need to be honest with each other that who is impacted by this is our children. And when we look at the statistics of kids who are not reading, with all due respect of what might be happening at your university, it is not working. What is being taught in our universities is not working. And we're hearing that directly from teachers who they may be learning theory and they step into the classroom, especially our general education teachers are telling us, I took out all of these loans. I put in hundreds of hours of time at my university, at my college. I step into the classroom and I am utterly unprepared to be able to actually teach the majority of my children how to read. I am at sea. We are hearing this over and over again. And so I really appreciate the question about which university in Oregon is doing it right, is getting it right. And Eastern Oregon University has deliberately revamped their entire teacher prep program to be premised on the bedrock of this 40 years of science and research that shows us how children and adults can learn how to read. And I want to go back to this idea of tutoring, right? So I think we can stop using language around fighting and adults' comfort, because we know that if a child struggles to learn how to read and her or his or their parents have enough resources, they hire a tutor who is expert, and that child learns to read. So what does that tutor have that our general education teachers don't? And that's what we're trying to do, is to get in the hands of our teachers here in Oregon the tools they need, because what's happening now is failing our children. They do not have access to the liberation, the autonomy, the freedom that we were talking about when we concentrate too much on, are we talking about turning children into robots? Absolutely not. We're talking about giving them the foundational key to unlock the language, and multilingual learners need those keys more than anyone else. They can't jump. None of us can jump to comprehension if we can't decode the letters and the words on the page. So I just want to emphasize again how much we appreciate Eastern Oregon's leadership in this area. And we have struggled, I'll be frank with you. Here, even in Portland, we have approached Portland State University to try and revamp their program. The special education program at PSU is amazing. Their teachers do get not just the theory, they get the steps to be able to teach their children. And the pushback from the academy around academic freedom has been, frankly, incredibly soul destroying, because we see the outcome. We know our kids aren't reading. Why are we not all collectively working to get them what they need?
Can I just make just one other observation about the NCTQ rating system? Because
Sure. And just for our audience, the NCTQ,
the National
Council on Teacher Quality.
Yes.
Go right ahead.
So just to add to what I was saying about the limited methodology, one of my, if you look at the NCTQ ratings, you'll see that states who got A's were places like Alabama and Tennessee, which are not exactly known for the high quality of their literacy instruction or the success of their students. So I just want to point out that these are really limited ways to think about teacher preparation. They are primarily premised on the idea of the science of reading. And I absolutely do not dismiss that kids need to be taught explicit phonics, phonemic awareness. In fact, just the other day, I was over at the Eugene 4J School District looking at the curriculum with some teachers, because they have a new curriculum in Eugene 4J, the Wit and Wisdom literacy curriculum, which includes a connection to the phonemic awareness curriculum, Haggerty, the phonics curriculum, Fundations. Yes, Fundations. And the Wit and Wisdom is the thematic curriculum that goes along with that. And so I was over in 4J looking at the curriculum and thinking about data and how all of these connections are happening. And I was actually very impressed with the way that they're really working hard to make sure that their primary teachers spend the 15 to 20 minutes a day on phonemic awareness, the 15 to 20 minutes a day on explicit phonics instruction, the 30 minutes on thematic literacy units, the 30 minutes on writing, right? So all these pieces fit together in a way that I think they're working to try to address some of this in their, and certainly they've seen the slide. I was just looking at the data from 2020 and 2021, but they're doing it in a way that is really balanced, that is acknowledging that all of these pieces are important, and we want kids to be engaged in comprehension. I still would push back a little bit on the assertion that kids cannot engage in comprehension until they're decoding. Clearly, kids are deep thinkers and can have meaningful conversation around text that teachers read to them, even if they can't decode them themselves. That is a literacy behavior. So I just want to keep that definition of literacy expansive.
Thank you. Karen, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. And I so appreciate this conversation about honestly how difficult it is to teach reading. And I don't think that most people have experienced that, actually needing to teach another person to read, not supporting their literacy, but actually teaching their literacy. And it's complex. My question, with that in mind, is related to something that I think all three of our speakers mentioned. And it's really about making the space for the improvements that we're imagining. Do we need to be talking about longer school years in Oregon, more instructional time? How is it that we could possibly address a crisis of the scale that is being described today and not actually have more hours for instructional time with students, more quality time for them to engage these questions? The little I know about the best literacy outcomes and love of reading outcomes in the world are in countries that have a lot more time in school. And I'm just curious what you all think about that.
Sure, I'll start. Yeah, I'll call out that part of the Student Success Act allowable funding is for more instructional time, right? That is critical. This is, you can go back to talk about big picture, concerns. We continue to have our education on this, antiquated agrarian schedule of September to June, right? That literally 1/4 of every year, kids are out of school, out of those structured learning environments. I got to say, I came into the legislature believing very strongly in year-round school, and I went and checked in on a couple. There's a Portland Public School that did an experiment with that. There's a couple private schools here that are on a year-round calendar. I still, in my belief in yes and, I still believe that could make a significant difference. I have also since then come to appreciate another approach to that, which is expanded summer learning. Because summer learning provides a well-structured summer program, which my friends at Oregon Ask would be horrified that I can't remember. There's like a couple baselines of what a really good summer learning program has, and apologies to Oregon Ask, I can't quite remember all of them, but it's combined with food. That's always one thing. You always need transportation, but there's a thing about, and I think ideally it is between 4 and 6 weeks, and it is 4 to 6 hours a day at least. And the great thing about summer learning is it not only provides more resources for kids in there and in kind of an outside of the normal, 9 to 3, Monday through Friday feeling of the regular school year, but it also gives teachers often a way to experiment with new curriculums or new kinds of presentations, other things like that. So I believe, I very strongly believe in and support, we do need more school hours. We need, and whether that's year round or whether that's more summer learning, I'll take it, because you're right. It is extremely, it's extremely important. And the last thing I'll say is that if you look at statistics about the opportunity gap between low-income kids, historically underserved kids, it can be drawn, so much of it can be drawn to summer learning loss, because kids learn at the same rates when they're in school and when they're in classrooms. It's that summer chunk of time when kids with more resources go to summer camps, go to, travel, whatever it is, continue to do summer reading programs, continue to have that engagement and education focus, and other kids who lose that and are, whatever, they're not accessing any of that. That is where the gap continues and, continues and broadens.
Barbara, if I may also piggyback on what you were saying, I do think that longer school years and more instructional time is beneficial. And at the same time, I want to point to the success of a tutoring program, high dosage intensive tutoring program that's rooted in the science of reading that's been happening in Morrow County here in Oregon. So you have had tutors coming in virtually into the school for 15 minutes a day with kids who are not or have not been meeting benchmark. And over time, the data from this program shows that achievement gaps were narrowed very, very quickly with this intensive tutoring. And the achievement gaps, those gains were across learners. So that means that students experiencing poverty were making gains at the same rates as their wealthier counterparts. Also in terms of race and in terms of our English learners, those students and also our children who are in special education. So to me, I think we really need to be smart and strategic about if that's working, if we know what's working, why are we not making that accessible for all of the students in our most struggling schools? There's no reason why we should be withholding this from those kids. And I think I appreciate, Barbara, very much that you introduced it last time to be able to do that. And I'm hopeful we'll be able to get it across the line in the next legislative session.
I think one thing to consider is that when we talk about kids and we talk about the kinds of programs that serve kids, which kids are we talking about? Because I think it's certainly true that for children who struggle with reading, who are identified with special needs or who have dyslexia, which has been a very powerful voice in all of this conversation, but is a small percentage of the population. So according to the International Dyslexia Association, maybe about 6% of children, no, not even, maybe about 4% of children in the K-12 school system nationwide are identified as having dyslexia. So absolutely, many of the tutoring programs that you refer to, the private tutoring programs, the, the Gillingham programs that are so popular in those programs absolutely work for children who have identified learning disabilities that are specifically phonological processing and phonics disabilities.
Professor Sarah,
yeah,
I'm sorry, I must interrupt you because these tutoring programs are not only for students with dyslexia or IEPs or individual education plans. These tutoring programs have been working with kids who are not identified that way, but still struggle, which is the majority of kids in our schools. So I think that when we teach to children who might have dyslexia or special education needs, we're actually teaching to the majority of children who struggle to learn how to read. We don't have to pit one group against each other. We're talking about the majority of children in our schools who don't know how, and we're trying to get them the tools that they need.
So if you'll let me finish, what I was going to say is that those programs have been very widely lauded for their work with children with identified special needs and perhaps children without identified special needs. But one of the concerns I have, and I'll circle back to thinking about ELL students, is that a lot of the data that I've seen in Oregon schools and that's been published in the literature is that generally by 4th grade, ELL children are on par in decoding with their English monolingual peers. Where they really struggle is in vocabulary, comprehension. I mean, it makes sense, right? Once you learn the phonological system and the phonics system, you can decode. I could decode Korean very easily because I spent a year living in Korea. However, my understanding of Korean is exceedingly low. So research has shown repeatedly that these kids catch up in decoding. That's not where the problems are, right? The problems are in vocabulary and comprehension and deep engagement with text and understanding how authors structure texts to communicate particular stories, right? And so I'm saying a lot of this gets stuck on early reading and foundational skills. And I can assure you that history shows over and over again that when we focus on these prescriptive rote programs, the kids who get stuck in these programs for years are low-income and minoritized children. None of the wealthy families I know would stand for that being the bulk of their children's literacy time, right? Because they want their kids to be thinking big ideas, to be writing creatively, to be engaging deeply with text, all of those. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you, Angela, in your argument that reading is power, right? There is no question that those who get to tell the stories in our society control society. So I absolutely want kids to be engaged readers and writers. It's what I've devoted my entire career to. But I'm hesitant to say that by providing more and more and more of this foundational work to all students, even students who may not need that much or that prescriptive of phonics and phonemic awareness instruction, is a good use of instructor time.
Thank you very much. You mentioned, Professor, that the so-called reading awards have been going on for centuries, seemingly. And indeed, in the run-up to this panel today, I was reading an article from The Atlantic that is 25 years old this month, saying that this dispute about reading concerns how people learn, what schools should be for, and the essential nature of a good society. And that made me think about all the other disputes that are roiling public education in the United States now. And so my question for the three of you is, how do we prevent reading from becoming one of those issues? How do we keep this issue of literacy education out of politics, in the sense that we want to keep it out of partisan, polarized politics, and make sure that we keep it on a track that focuses on what students need and how kids learn? And I'm happy to hear from any of you on this.
Well, Andrew, I'm happy to jump in. I'd encourage everyone listening to start with the reporting of Emily Hanford. She's an incredible investigative reporter. She has a podcast out now, which is called Sold a Story. And so it does give those of us who might be coming to the idea of a literacy crisis or emergency, she gives a really powerful background on how it is that we got here and how we need to get out of where we are. And I think, again, I really want us to focus on what we do to solve this problem. When we're looking at 40 years of research when it comes to the science of reading, it feels akin to me to debates we were having 10 years ago over climate science and this idea that, oh, is climate change real or is it not? Like, we know what students need to be able to access learning. And we can look at Mississippi, for example, where they've trained all of their K-5 teachers in the science of reading. They're the only state in the nation that has shown steady growth and maintenance of growth when it comes to 4th grade reading scores. So Oregon has a chance to take a page from other states that are doing well. And I think I'd also ask a question of our current universities, and maybe Professor Lucero, you could answer this too. What do you say to the teachers who emerge from programs who are telling us they are not prepared to teach reading, and that when they have access to trainings that give them those tools, it transforms what's happening in their classrooms for their students? What are we, and what's our answer, not just to those teachers, but to our students? We can't ask our students to wait a day longer when it comes to being able to access reading.
Well, I can't exactly speak to that because honestly, I haven't had students say that to me, former students. I will say, though, as I said at the beginning of this workshop, that in a group of teachers I'm working with right now, who are not former students of the U of O, but they're in-service teachers from around Western Oregon, that when we asked them what were the challenges they were facing in their classroom, what would they like to do more of, as I said earlier, what one of them said to me is that I would like to see more excitement and engagement and love of literacy, because I think that kids are going through the motions, but they're not engaging with text meaningfully. And I'll just give you an example from when I was a 1st grade teacher before I went to get my PhD. And I used to teach in an area of Seattle that was very culturally and linguistically diverse. The majority of students in my class were Vietnamese or Chinese speaking at home. And I was once working with a little guy who was a struggling reader. And he was kind of going through trying to decode a decodable book, the box set on the ox or something like that. And he miscued. So he said something that was not the word, that didn't make any sense in the context of what he was reading. And so I asked him, think about that for a minute. Does that make sense? And he just looked at me as if I were crazy, like, oh, it's supposed to make sense. And that's when I realized that the instruction that I had been providing to these children was very like phonics based, like, okay, here's how you sound out these two. But there was no larger understanding of text being meaningful. And I think that's what set me on this path of doing the work that I do now, is like, okay. But if what we're doing is words of list, and when you talk about reading assessment data, I'm sure, Angela, that you have seen the reading assessments that they use, right? Word lists and passages that may or may not have any meaning to children, that may or may not draw on their background knowledge or their experiences. So if kids learn that reading is about decoding word lists, I don't blame them for not being interested, frankly. It sounds incredibly boring to me. So that's all I can say, having not had those conversations with teachers that I've worked with over my career.
Representative, you're the politician in the room for a few more months anyway. Do you have a feeling about how we keep politics out of this, or whether we should?
You know, if you had told me, I don't know, 2 years ago that there would be politics about whether the person who got more votes in the election actually won the election, that like foundational thing of our democracy would become politicized, you know, maybe I wouldn't have believed you, although maybe I would have. So yeah, I would just say that, yeah, that I think all we can do not to, and to acknowledge that, again, just getting back to the foundation of, and I'm a Gemini. I'm also a legislator, so I'm used to like having a lot of differences and trying to kind of figure out the middle on it. But just that on, you know, again, if you can't sound it out, you're never gonna get to comprehension. You're never gonna get to wherever. I think the fact that our literacy rates of kids just have gone down for the, you know, continue to go down, whether it's nationally or in the state, that needs to be the driving force. And that needs to be what we hold in the center is these kids, and what is, you know, what is and is not working, and to focus on yes and just keep that in the center of what we do, and not, you know, period. I'll just stop there.
Great. We have 30 seconds left. One last question. If you could remove one obstacle currently standing in the way of solving Oregon's literacy success, what obstacle would you remove?
Well, I don't know if this counts as removing or not, but I would completely reconsider the assessment systems that we use in schools. I think when we look at the ways in which we assess kids with things like word reading fluency, passage reading fluency, that are literally 1-minute assessments, I think that's giving a false picture to some extent of what kids can do. I also think that there's a far over reliance on fluency as word reading fluency, passage reading fluency. That is, how many words can you read in 1 minute? You know, fluency is not a fixed trait. It's not like this person is fluent, that person's not fluent. It's always a relationship between a reader, a text and a reader. So it is a good comprehension strategy to slow down when you don't understand something. But if kids do that on these assessments, they're marked as a non-fluent reader or a student who's struggling with fluency. So I think really the assessment system is something that we need to seriously consider, because those are statistics we cite all the time.
Thank you.
I think for me, the biggest obstacle is complacency. So we know that there's a crisis that has turned into an emergency. What are we going to do to help the children of this state learn to read? They deserve to have that liberation. They deserve to have that freedom and autonomy. And we can argue all day long about staying where we are, and our children will not move forward without our immediate help. So I hope that people will join in the sense of emergency and the sense of urgency, and knowing that there are proven solutions that we can move forward towards together for our kids.
Representative, do you want to share one obstacle you would remove, or?
No,
it's more complicated than that?
I think they both may. I agree with both of them, and
Terrific.
I would defer to both Dr. Lucero and Angela on that.
Terrific. Well, thank the three of you very much for coming and sharing your expertise and your wisdom with us. That is all the time we have for the City Club of Eugene this week. We are off next week. We'll be back the following week. But for now, I will kick it back to City Club President Karin Knutson.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all of our speakers today. What a fascinating conversation about the literacy crisis in Oregon and how we can better serve our kids and communities. This has been our November 4th, 2022 conversation at the City Club of Eugene, Literacy in Oregon, Challenges and Solutions. Before we thank our speakers one last time today, I would like to recognize City Club's Diamond sponsors. Kaiser Permanente exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. You can learn more information at www.kp.org. The University of Oregon has helped Oregonians to question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically since 1876. And you can learn more at uoregon.edu. Peace Health has been proud to serve Eugene, Lane County, and beyond as your hometown healthcare partner for more than 80 years. The Peace Health mission is to keep you and your family healthy. You can learn more at peacehealth.org. And Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, please visit lanecc.edu. And thank you to the City of Eugene and Lane County for their support. Thank you also to today's Sapphire sponsor, Summit Bank. Founded in 2004, Summit Bank is the only independent community bank headquartered in Eugene. Summit Bank is Oregon's business bank, and Summit's mission is to be the best community bank for business and professionals. You can learn more about that mission at sbko.bank. Thank you to today's gold sponsors, Network Charter School and Sacred Earth Botanicals, and to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, Pack Info and Simplified Computing, LLC, and Dotson's Photography. And of course, a special thank you to our award-winning public radio station, KLCC FM 89.7, for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7 p.m. You can find all recent City Club programs archived on KLCC, as well as our YouTube channel and as podcasts. Next week, as Andrew mentioned, City Club will take the week off to honor the Veterans Day holiday, and we will return for lunch and an in-person meeting on November 18th with a program on the state of the university with interim University of Oregon President Patrick Phillips. The University of Oregon now has 22,298 students. Do you have any idea what the U of O's top 10 majors are in 2022? What we've learned lately about dark matter and dark energy in the center of the universe, and how the university is balancing its research prowess and commitment to teaching. What will Connie and Steve Ballmer's $425 million gift to create the Ballmer Institute for Children's Behavioral Health do to transform child and adolescent health and wellness? We'll look forward to welcoming U of O Interim President Patrick Phillips and asking some of these questions and many others in a few weeks. If you have a suggestion for a topic or an issue that you think should be discussed at City Club, please visit our website, cityclubofeugene.org, and make that suggestion. We would love to hear from you, and we welcome everyone to join the conversation. If you have a question about an upcoming program or for an upcoming speaker, please also email us at info@cityclubofeugene.org. It has been our absolute pleasure to welcome you today to this conversation at the City Club of Eugene. Thank you again to our speakers, Professor Audrey Lucero, Representative Barbara Smith-Warner, and writer and literacy advocate Angela Uerbelau. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.